The obese girl was chained and auctioned off. What the mountain man did shocks entire town. The autumn wind cut through the streets of Redemption Creek like a blade, carrying with it the scent of wood smoke and something far more sinister, the stench of human cruelty. It was 1847, and the small trading town nestled in the shadow of the Rocky Mountains had seen its share of darkness, but nothing quite like what was about to unfold in the town square that cold October morning. Elias Thornwood stood at the edge of the crowd, his weathered face partially hidden beneath the brim of his hat. At 6'4", with shoulders broad as an ox yoke and hands that could crush stone, he was an imposing figure even among the rough men of the frontier. His buckskin coat, decorated with intricate beadwork gifted by the Shoshone tribe, marked him as a mountain man, one of those wild souls who preferred the company of wolves and eagles to the so-called civilization of settlements. He had come to Redemption Creek reluctantly, needing supplies before the winter snows sealed the high country. He had planned to conduct his business quickly and return to his cabin in the mountains, but the commotion in the square had drawn him like a moth to flame, though he wished it hadn't. "Come one! Come all!" bellowed Augustus Blackwell, the town's wealthiest merchant, and a man whose reputation for cruelty was matched only by his greed. He stood on a wooden platform, his silk vest straining against his considerable girth, his face flushed with excitement and whiskey. "Today we have a special item for auction, strong as an ox, this one, perfect for heavy labor." Elias felt his jaw tighten as the crowd parted, revealing the subject of Blackwell's grotesque spectacle. A young woman, no more than 19 or 20, stood on the platform in chains. She was indeed large, her body carrying weight that marked her as different in a time when food was scarce, and most settlers were gaunt from hard labor and meager rations. Her dress, little more than burlap sacking, hung in tatters. Her feet were bare despite the cold, and her wrists were rubbed raw from iron shackles. But it was her eyes that struck Elias like a physical blow. They were the color of storm clouds over the mountains, gray and deep, and they held a mixture of terror, defiance, and something else. A flicker of hope that refused to die despite the degradation she endured. "Her name is Marguerite," Blackwell continued, circling the girl like a vulture around carrion. "Came west with a wagon train that met with misfortune. I acquired her debts legally and proper-like. She's strong, can work long hours, and while she ain't much to look at, she can earn her keep and then some." The crowd laughed, and Elias felt his blood turn to ice in his veins. He had seen many terrible things in his 38 years: starvation, violence, the casual cruelty of men who had forgotten they were human. But this spectacle of selling a human being like livestock turned his stomach. Marguerite kept her chin up despite the jeers and crude comments from the crowd. Elias could see her trembling, whether from cold or fear he couldn't tell, but she refused to bow her head. There was strength in her, he realized, a core of iron wrapped in soft flesh. "We'll start the bidding at $50, Blackwell announced. "Who'll give me 50 for this prime specimen of working flesh?" 30, called out Jacob Muller, who owned the largest farm outside town. "And that's generous for one so fat. She'll eat more than she's worth." The crowd erupted in laughter again, and Elias saw Marguerite flinch as if each word was a physical blow. Her hands clenched into fists, the chains rattling with the movement. $40, shouted another voice. "I'll work the fat off her soon enough." More laughter, more cruel jests. Elias felt something inside him snap, that thin thread that had kept him tethered to civility and the rules of so-called decent society. He had spent 15 years in the mountains precisely to escape this kind of casual brutality dressed up as commerce and law. $500, Elias said quietly. The square fell silent. Heads turned toward him like sunflowers following the sun. Augustus Blackwell's piggy eyes widened in surprise, then narrowed with greedy calculation. "What was that, stranger?" Blackwell asked, his voice dripping with false politeness. Did I hear you correctly?" Elias stepped forward, the crowd parting before him like water before the prow of a ship. He moved with the easy, deadly grace of a man who had fought grizzlies and survived winters that would have killed lesser men. When he spoke again, his voice was low and carried the rumble of distant thunder. $500. Gold coin, and I want those chains off her now. Marguerite's eyes found his across the crowd, and for a moment the world seemed to narrow to just the two of them. He saw confusion in her gaze, then a desperate, fragile hope that made his heart clench painfully in his chest. Blackwell licked his lips, his mind clearly calculating. $500 was more than he had expected to get for the girl, probably 10 times more. But he was also a man who couldn't resist trying to squeeze every last drop from a situation. "Well now," Blackwell said slowly, "that's a generous offer indeed. But I'm thinking a man who offers such a sum so quickly might be willing to go higher. What say we?" $500, Elias repeated, his voice hardening. "Take it now, or I walk away and you'll be lucky to get 30 from these bottom feeders." He let his hand rest casually on the handle of his knife, a weapon with a blade as long as a man's forearm, honed to razor sharpness. "And I'd advise you to take those chains off the lady before I take offense at how you're treating her." The threat hung in the air like smoke. Everyone in Redemption Creek knew stories of mountain men, wild, dangerous men who lived by their own code and had little patience for civilization's rules. They also knew that a man who wore Shoshone beadwork had friends among the tribes, which made him doubly dangerous in these parts. Blackwell swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. Of course, a deal's a deal." He snapped his fingers at his assistant, a Weasley man named Perkins. "Get those chains off her and bring her down." As Perkins fumbled with the locks, Elias pulled a leather pouch from inside his coat and counted out gold coins onto a barrel head, solid American eagles that rang true when they struck wood. The crowd watched in stunned silence as he completed the transaction with the same casual efficiency he might use to buy a new rifle. When the chains finally fell away from Marguerite's wrists, she stumbled, her legs weakened from standing in one position too long. Elias moved quickly, catching her before she could fall. She gasped at the contact, looking up at him with those storm-gray eyes full of questions and wariness. "Can you walk?" he asked gently, his rough voice softening in a way that surprised even himself. She nodded mutely, not trusting her voice. Elias shrugged out of his bearskin coat and draped it over her shoulders. It swallowed her frame, hanging nearly to her ankles, but it was warm and it covered the rags of her dress. "Come on then," he said. "Let's get out of this cesspit." As they walked through the crowd, Elias was acutely aware of the stares, the whispers, the judgment. He heard the muttered comments. "Mountain man's taking himself a fat squaw. Probably planning to use her for bear bait. $500 for that?" But he ignored them all, keeping his hand lightly on Marguerite's elbow to steady her as she walked. They stopped at the general store where Elias had left his pack horse. He loaded her onto the animal with surprising gentleness for such a large man, then gathered the supplies he'd come for: flour, salt, coffee, ammunition, and a few other necessities. He also bought a dress, 2 pairs of sturdy boots, stockings, and a warm wool cloak. The storekeeper raised an eyebrow, but said nothing as Elias paid for everything in gold. It wasn't until they were a mile outside of town, climbing the trail that led into the high country, that Marguerite finally spoke. "Why?" Her voice was hoarse, barely more than a whisper. "Why did you do that?" Elias didn't answer immediately. He walked ahead of the horse, leading it carefully along the rocky trail, his eyes scanning the tree line out of long habit. Finally, as they reached a clearing with a view of the valley below, he stopped and turned to look at her. "Because it was wrong," he said simply, "what they were doing to you. It was wrong, and I had the means to stop it, so I did." "But $500? She shook her head in disbelief. "That's a fortune. You don't even know me." "I know enough," Elias replied. "I know you kept your head up when they tried to break you down. I know you didn't cry, even when they mocked you. That takes strength, Miss Marguerite. More strength than most of those soft-bellied townfolk will ever have. Tears welled in her eyes, the first she had allowed herself since this nightmare began. What happens now? What do you want from me? Elias studied her for a long moment. I want you to survive. I want you to be free. Beyond that, he shrugged. I live alone in a cabin about 2 days' ride into the mountains. It's not much, but it's warm and safe. You're welcome to stay through the winter, get your strength back. Come spring, I'll help you get wherever you want to go, back east, to Oregon, wherever. Or if you want to stay in the mountains, that's fine too. It's your choice, your life. I'm not your master, and I don't believe in owning people. They made camp that night in a grove of aspens, their golden leaves whispering secrets in the wind. Elias built a fire and cooked a simple meal of cornbread and beans, supplemented with some dried elk meat from his supplies. He watched as Marguerite ate slowly at first, then with increasing hunger, as if she hadn't had a proper meal in weeks. When did Blackwell last feed you? He asked quietly. She looked down at her plate. 3 days ago. He said I needed to lose weight before the auction, that no one would buy a fat cow who'd eat them out of house and home. Her voice broke on the last words. Elias felt rage kindle in his chest again, but he forced it down. Anger wouldn't help her now. You eat as much as you want, he said firmly. You need your strength for the journey ahead. As the fire crackled between them, Marguerite began to talk. The words came slowly at first, then faster, as if a dam had broken. She told him about the wagon train, about how her family had died of cholera on the trail, about how Blackwell had offered to help her, claiming he would find her respectable work in Redemption Creek. Instead, he had claimed she owed him money for room and board and had kept adding to the debt until she was trapped. He said I was worthless, she whispered, staring into the flames, that no man would ever want me because of how I look, that the only value I had was as a work animal. Elias was quiet for a moment, then spoke in that low, rumbling voice. A man named Black Hawk, a Shoshone chief, once told me something I never forgot. He said that the Great Spirit made all creatures different for a reason. The bear is strong, the deer is swift, the eagle sees far. Each has its purpose, its own kind of beauty. Humans are no different. He paused, choosing his words carefully. Blackwell is a small man, Miss Marguerite, small in spirit and mean in nature. His words about you say everything about him and nothing about you. She looked at him then, really looked at him, seeing past the scarred face and rough exterior to the decent man beneath. You really believe that, don't you? It's not just pretty words. I don't traffic in pretty words, Elias said with a slight smile. I'm not clever enough for that. I just say what's true. The next 2 days of travel were challenging. The mountain trails were steep and often treacherous, but Elias knew them like the lines on his own palm. He was patient with Marguerite, stopping frequently to let her rest, never complaining when her inexperience with wilderness travel slowed their pace. At night, he slept on the opposite side of the fire, giving her privacy and space, making it clear through his actions that she had nothing to fear from him. During the day, he talked to her about the mountains, pointing out animal tracks, teaching her which plants were safe to eat and which were poison, sharing the knowledge that had kept him alive in this unforgiving land. Marguerite found herself fascinated by this strange, quiet man who had appeared like something out of a legend to save her. He moved through the wilderness with unconscious grace, reading the forest like others read books. He spoke to his horse like it was an old friend, and birds seemed to follow him from tree to tree. On the evening of the second day, they crested a ridge, and Marguerite gasped. Before them lay a valley of such pristine beauty it seemed untouched by human hands. A crystal-clear stream wound through meadows of wild grass, aspens clustered along the water's edge, and beyond it all rose the snow-capped peaks of the Rockies, glowing pink in the sunset. "It's beautiful," she breathed. "Home," Elias said simply, and she heard the deep contentment in his voice. His cabin sat on a small rise overlooking the stream. It was larger than she had expected, built of logs chinked with clay, with a stone chimney that spoke of many comfortable fires. Nearby stood a small barn for his horse and a smokehouse. Everything was neat and well maintained, evidence of a man who took pride in his work. Inside, the cabin was surprisingly cozy. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall, with a bearskin rug spread before it. There was a kitchen area with a proper cast-iron stove, a table and chairs carved from pine, and shelves lined with books, more books than she had expected a mountain man to own. "You read?" she asked, surprised. Elias looked almost embarrassed. "My mother was a school teacher back in Virginia. She made sure I had an education before I headed west. Books are good company on long winter nights." He showed her to a small room partitioned off from the main living area. It had a real bed with a straw mattress, a chest for clothes, and a small window that looked out on the mountain peaks. "It's not much," he said, "but it's yours. I'll bunk out in the main room." "This is yours," Marguerite protested. "I can't take your bed." "You can, and you will," Elias said firmly. "I've spent 15 winters sleeping on floors and worse. This isn't a hardship for me, Miss Marguerite. Please let me do this." Over the following weeks, they fell into a routine. Elias taught Marguerite the skills she would need to survive in the mountains: how to chop wood properly, how to tend a fire, how to preserve meat and vegetables for the winter. He taught her to shoot, starting with a small rifle and working up to larger weapons, praising her natural aim and steady hands. In return, Marguerite brought order to the cabin. She cooked proper meals, mended his clothes, organized his somewhat chaotic collection of supplies. She read aloud from his books in the evenings, her voice bringing life to the old stories and poems he had read alone for so many years. They talked during those long autumn evenings, sharing their histories. Elias told her about his life before the mountains, his family back east, his years as a fur trapper, his decision to live alone rather than return to a civilization he no longer understood. Marguerite spoke of her childhood in Pennsylvania, her parents' decision to go west seeking a better life, and the terrible journey that had ended in such tragedy. "Do you ever get lonely?" she asked one night as they sat by the fire, the wind howling outside but the cabin warm and snug. Elias considered the question seriously. "I used to," he admitted, "but I learned to find peace in solitude. The mountains are good teachers. They show you what's important and what's just noise." He paused, although I'll admit, having someone to talk to has been pleasant. As winter closed in and the first snows began to fall, Marguerite realized she was healing, not just physically, though the regular meals and honest work had given her strength she'd never known before. She was healing emotionally, learning to see herself through Elias's eyes rather than through the cruel lens of men like Blackwell. Elias treated her with unfailing respect and kindness. He never commented on her size except to praise her strength when she accomplished difficult tasks. He never made her feel like a burden, though she knew she ate more than he did. He simply accepted her as she was, and in that acceptance, she began to accept herself. One evening in late November, as the first major blizzard of the season raged outside, Marguerite looked up from the book she was reading to find Elias watching her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. "What is it?" she asked. He seemed to struggle with his words, then spoke slowly. "I've been thinking about spring, about you leaving, and I've realized I don't want you to go." Her heart began to pound. "What do you mean?" Elias stood and paced to the window, looking out at the swirling snow. "I mean, I've grown accustomed to having you here. More than accustomed, He turned to face her. "I know I'm not much. I'm rough and scarred and half wild. I know you could do better, probably should do better. But if you're willing, I'd like you to stay. Not as a guest or a housekeeper, but as my wife. If you'll have me." Marguerite set down her book with trembling hands. "Elias, I'm not the kind of woman men marry. You've seen me. You know what I look like." He crossed the room in 3 strides and knelt before her chair, taking her hands in his large, calloused ones. I've seen you chop wood in a blizzard because you were worried I'd overwork myself. I've seen you nurse a injured hawk back to health with the patience of a saint. I've watched you face down your fears every single day and keep going anyway. That's what I see when I look at you, Marguerite. I see strength and kindness and courage. And yes, I see a beautiful woman, though I know you don't believe that yet. Tears streamed down her face. You really mean it? I've never meant anything more in my life, Elias said quietly. But I need you to understand, I won't trap you here. If you want to leave come spring, I'll help you do that. This is only offered if it's truly what you want, not because you feel obligated or because you think you have nowhere else to go. Marguerite looked into his eyes, those honest, steady eyes that had never lied to her, and saw the truth of his words. He loved her. This rough mountain man who barely spoke 3 words to anyone actually loved her, not despite who she was, but because of it. Yes, she whispered, yes, I'll marry you. The kiss they shared was gentle and tentative, both of them new to this kind of affection. But it held a promise of warmth and companionship, of 2 wounded souls finding healing in each other. They married in early December, traveling down to Redemption Creek on a clear, cold day. Elias had sent word ahead to the circuit preacher, and they wed in the small church with only a handful of witnesses, the preacher, the storekeeper who had sold Elias the supplies, and a young couple who happened to be in town. The ceremony was simple, but when Elias slid a plain gold band onto Marguerite's finger, one he'd traded prime pelts for, she felt her heart overflow with joy. They were married in the eyes of God and law, and she was finally, truly free. As they walked out of the church, they nearly collided with Augustus Blackwell on the street. The merchant's face turned purple when he recognized them. You, he sputtered at Elias, you and that fat... He never finished the sentence. Elias's fist connected with his jaw with the force of a sledgehammer, sending Blackwell sprawling into the mud of the street. The mountain man stood over him, his face calm, but his eyes blazing with cold fury. That's my wife you're speaking about, Elias said quietly, his voice carrying clearly in the sudden silence that had fallen over the street. And if I ever hear you say one more disrespectful word about her, if I even hear you've thought something unkind about her, I'll come back down from my mountain and finish what I just started. Are we clear? Blackwell, his face already swelling, nodded frantically. Elias helped Marguerite onto his horse, then swung up behind her. As they rode out of town, she heard the whispers starting, saw the shocked faces. Let them whisper, she thought. Let them be shocked. She had found something more precious than all the gold in California. She had found a man who saw her true worth, and in seeing it, had helped her see it too. That winter was the happiest either of them had ever known. Elias taught Marguerite to ski on crude wooden skis he carved, and they laughed together like children as she tumbled into snowdrifts. She taught him to dance, humming waltzes as they moved awkwardly around the cabin's main room. They read together, cooked together, and talked for hours about everything and nothing. As the snows deepened and the world outside became a pristine wonderland of white, they built a life together, not the life that society had told them they should want, but the life they had chosen for themselves. Spring came eventually, as it always does in the mountains. The snow melted, revealing the green world beneath, and the valley came alive with wildflowers and birdsong. Elias had worried that Marguerite might have second thoughts, that she might want to return to civilization now that travel was possible again. But one morning in early May, he woke to find her already up, standing on the porch and looking out over their valley. He came to stand beside her, and she leaned into him, fitting perfectly against his side. "I was thinking," she said, "that we should plant a garden this year. A big one. Maybe expand the cabin a bit, too. Add another room." "Another room?" Elias asked, his heart beginning to pound. She turned to look at him, her storm-gray eyes bright with joy and a hint of nervousness. "Well, we'll need the space. Come winter, there's going to be 3 of us." For a moment, Elias couldn't speak. Then he swept her into his arms, spinning her around while she laughed with delight. When he set her down, there were tears in his eyes, the first tears she had ever seen him shed. "A baby," he whispered, touching her face with wonder. "Our baby." "Are you happy?" she asked, though she could already see the answer in his eyes. "Happier than I have any right to be," he said. "You've given me everything, Marguerite. A home, a family, a reason to wake up each morning with joy in my heart. I love you more than I have words to express." "I love you too," she said, "my mountain man, my hero, my home." The word of their marriage and Marguerite's pregnancy eventually filtered back to Redemption Creek, carried by trappers and traders who passed through their valley. The story grew with each telling. The mountain man who had paid a fortune for a girl no one else wanted, who had treated her like a queen and loved her like a treasure. Some in town shook their heads, unable to understand it, but others, particularly the women who had watched Marguerite's humiliation that awful day, understood perfectly. They understood that true love sees beneath the surface, that real strength comes in many forms, and that sometimes the most unlikely heroes come from the wildest places. In December of that year, during the first real snowstorm of the season, Marguerite gave birth to a healthy baby girl with her father's dark hair and her mother's gray eyes. Elias held his daughter with the same gentle strength he had shown Marguerite from the very beginning, tears streaming down his scarred face as he marveled at the tiny miracle in his arms. They named her Hope, because that was what Marguerite had held on to during her darkest hours, that flicker of hope that had kept her from breaking. And now that hope had blossomed into a beautiful life full of love and joy and possibility. Years passed. They had 2 more children, a son they named Daniel, and another daughter they called Grace. The cabin grew to accommodate their expanding family, and the valley rang with the sounds of children's laughter. Elias taught his children everything he knew about the mountains, while Marguerite ensured they could read and write and understand the world beyond their valley. Occasionally, they would go down to Redemption Creek for supplies, and people would stare at the odd family, the giant mountain man, his large wife, and their healthy, happy children. Some still whispered, but the whispers had changed. Now they spoke of the love between Elias and Marguerite, of how he looked at her like she hung the stars, of how she had made a real home in the wilderness. Augustus Blackwell, his fortunes having declined over the years, could only watch bitterly as the woman he had thought worthless lived a life richer than his own had ever been. He died alone and unmourned, while Elias and Marguerite grew old together, surrounded by children and eventually grandchildren. On their 25th anniversary, as they sat on their porch watching the sunset over the mountains they loved, Marguerite took Elias's weathered hand in hers. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked, "spending $500 on me that day?" Elias turned to look at her, his eyes still holding that same steady warmth they had held that first day in the town square. "Best investment I ever made," he said simply. "You gave me a life worth living, Marguerite. You made me rich beyond measure." She smiled and leaned her head against his shoulder, watching as their grandchildren played in the meadow below. From the house came the sounds of their children preparing dinner, the laughter and love that filled every corner of the home they had built together. This was their legacy. Not wealth or status or society's approval, but love. Real love. The kind that sees worth where others see only surface, that builds up instead of tearing down, that creates beauty in the most unlikely places. And if anyone had asked Elias Thornwood what he was most proud of in his long life, more than surviving the wilderness, more than his skills and his strength, he would have said simply, "I'm proud I saw her when no one else did. I'm proud I chose love."